Hey, you! Psst. Yes, you! Do you like socialism? Attracted to the ideas of communism? Like the state policy of the USSR? Socialism in one country. Sounds promising enough. Joseph Stalin thought so too when he first announced the slogan in 1924. But we all understand that an average citizen is a petty bourgeois. His own house or flat is a center of his world. He is the master here, and his everyday life is arranged the way he likes in his home. He probably lives according to the principle, my home is my fortress. And you? Are you ready to sacrifice your private space for the sake of a bright socialist future? If so, then you are welcome to the Kommunalka, comrade, the communal apartment. It is a story from a distant Soviet past, but I can still share my personal humble experience. When I was born, my parents were living in a 3-room apartment. 2 rooms belonged to my family and 1 room and the corridor belonged to our neighbor Tamara. Kitchen, bathroom and toilet were shared. I lived there for the first 5 years of my life, and I don't remember much from that period. The only thing I remember is my neighbor's cat, Izumrudka, who endlessly teased our cat. Poor guy was neutered and had absolutely no idea what she even wanted from him.
Silence, wench. I do not wish to be horny anymore.
Yes, our communal apartment experience was pretty mild. 2 rooms for 1 family and only 1 neighbor. Most people in USSR would have thought that those were great conditions. But you need to understand that even in the free democratic 90s, communal apartments took up 30% of Moscow's secondary housing market. 30%! In some other cities the percentage was even higher. But first, as always, we'll start with some history. The theorists and practitioners of communism understood perfectly well that in order to build a socialist society, all existing forms of society had to be eradicated. And they had to start from the very bottom, with the most basic thing that every man had, his home. Let us look at how this idea was born, how it evolved, why the Soviet Union eventually abandoned the concept of communal housing, and why some people still willingly live there in the 21st century. So, 1920s. Communism has won, but for some reason life in Russia does not automatically get better. So what to do, where to start? Marx and Engels were not good helpers here. They were philosophers. They happily filled hundreds of pages with their ideas. But they did not give any practical advice on the transition from capitalist society to socialist society. So the builders of communism had to move forward blindly. Let's try to follow their train of thought. What should we do first? Take everything away from the bourgeoisie? Done. A fancy mansion in the center of Moscow is taken away from some merchant and his family. What should we do next? Give this mansion to the poor. You, proletarian Ivanov, now it's your mansion. But wait, proletarian Petrov has to live somewhere too, as do his 5 children. Over there we have Comrade Kuznetsov without a place to live. And families of Matveyev, Lavrov and Maslov arrived as a part of industrialization from their villages. There are not enough mansions for all of them, and they don't want to go back to their villages. The country is heading towards urbanization. Alright, the Kuznetsov family gets this room, which used to be master's bedroom. The Ivanov family gets the living room, and Maslov and Lavrov are allowed to live in the servants' quarters. The house has 1 kitchen and no bathroom. You don't like living with 5 other families? Matveyev has to sleep in a hallway. Comrade, why would you say that? It is unworthy of a Soviet man. Are you even a communist? In 1990, the People's Commissariat of Health defined the sanitary norm of living space per person. 9.1 square meters. A room of 3 by 3 meters. Enough for a Soviet man. By the way, later these norms were decreased. The sanitary standard in 1930 was lowered to 5.5 square meters in Moscow, 3.5 meters in Chelyabinsk, 3.4 in Krasnoyarsk, and in Donbass to 2.2. That's how the first communal apartments appeared in the USSR. And they became the main form of housing for the majority of Soviet citizens for many years to come. There was even a lovely chistushka about it. and the flow of peasants from the villages to the cities never stopped. Families huddled in monasteries' cells, stables, cellars, closets. They endlessly divided the enfilades of rooms with plywood walls. People even lived in the bathrooms, I'm not kidding. Peasants and aristocrats, servants and landlords, intellectuals, proletarians, and people from nomenclatura learned to coexist peacefully. To cook meals in common kitchens, to bathe in common bathrooms, if there was one, and to use a common toilet. In some large apartments, the number of occupants would reach 100, with an average of 25 to 50. And then came the war, which deprived the USSR of about 70 million square meters of living space. Whole families had to live in dugouts and barracks. By the beginning of 1952, there were 3,758,000 people living in barracks, and the room in a communal apartment was a blessing to them. Of course, after the war, the country was gradually rebuilt. Huge communal apartments were replaced with smaller 2- or 3-room ones. And then with the unprecedented luxury of economical and comfortable flats which can be occupied by a single family. That's what they said about Hrushchevkas, you got it right. Now let's look at how life was organized in kommunalkas, how several families can even share such an important thing as an apartment. The first kommunalkas of the 1920s were a wild place. Relations between neighbors were not regulated in any way, and the slightest provocation could trigger an all-apartment scandal, sometimes involving violence. Gradually, however, people realized they would have to live in such conditions for a very long time, and they learned to adapt. Let's look at how life was organized in a typical medium-sized communal apartment. It was no longer a war zone. Often life in a kommunalka was like a life of one big family. A very odd family, but a family nonetheless. They quarreled, they insulted each other, they vented their nervous anger on each other, and yet they were a family. The first children of the kommunalkas grew up, children who perceived communal living as something normal and ordinary. They grew up in a communal apartment, started their own family, and moved to a new communal apartment. Space in a communal apartment was divided into 2 categories: private space and no one's space. The first category was the residence rooms. No one's space included corridors, a bathroom or shower room, a kitchen and a toilet. The first unspoken rule of a communal apartment is that no one is responsible for no one's places. In good kommunalkas, their use and cleaning was regulated by a schedule, which was agreed by the neighbors themselves. In bad apartments, neutral spaces were filled with residents' belongings, and there were endless conflicts over the right to use the bathroom in the evenings. Of course, there was usually no tub, it wasn't very hygienic. There was only a shower. Each family had its own soap. If you took someone else's soap, they will know about it, and there will be a scandal. That's where that famous window between the bathroom and the kitchen comes in handy. And you wondered what it was for. Of course, time for showering was also strictly limited. The rules for the kitchen depended on the size of the room. Very small kitchens had 2 or 3 cookers and 1 table. The cookers were then divided in half, each resident had 2 burners. Naturally, the pots and pans were also separate, with locks often attached to the pots to ward off evil neighbors. Meals were also eaten in their own rooms. In some kommunalkas, people dined together and shared meals, but that was the exception to the rule. Each communal apartment also had its own unspoken set of rules, limited only by residents' imagination. For example, one of the characters of the cult book The Little Golden Calf, Vasisuali Lakhankin, was whipped by his neighbors for keeping the light on in the loo. By the way, an absolutely terrific satirical book, which is not well known in the Western world. I really recommend it. It was easy to get into trouble for not following the rules of kommunalka. For example, the residents decided how and when to clean the bathroom. The common council decided the hours of silence in the communal apartment. For example, in one communal apartment no noise was allowed from 19 o'clock, although the law stipulated a fixed time at 23 o'clock. You couldn't argue with your neighbors, who were sure that they were right. Newcomers were quickly put in their place. I think you can now see why the introduction of Hrushchevkas was met with such enthusiasm. a separate apartment. That's just heaven on earth. But you also have to understand that communal apartments weren't originally some horrible and insidious plan of the Soviet government. They simply had no other choice. They tried to build socialism without any guidelines. Hence all those strange inventions of the early years of the USSR. Communal flats, kitchen factories, house communes. All this was done in order to make people accustomed to collectivism and to free them from the burdens of domestic work, family ties and all other trivial private things. But gradually it became clear that all of this only worked in the minds of Marxists and Leninists. Eventually all of this was abandoned. However, as I said, I was born in the early 90s and lived in a communal apartment for the first few years of my life. Some people still live in such flats. How? Why? For what? Of course, the main issue here is financial. Take Moscow as an example. As I said before, in the 1990s, up to 30% of Moscow residents lived in communalkas. Yes, they were able to privatize them. Let's say they got their own room. But what could they do with it next? Try selling a room in a communal apartment to some fool. Even if there is someone willing to buy the whole apartment, each resident will get not a large amount of money. It would be difficult to buy an equivalent one-bedroom apartment. And this is Moscow, I'm not even talking about poorer regions. Yes, the government has tried to implement resettlement programs, but some residents flatly refused to worsen their living conditions and move to other areas. Imagine a communal apartment with 20 rooms. One babushka has spent all her life in that neighborhood and doesn't want to move to another one, even to a separate flat. She doesn't want to, that's all.
Nope.
That's why even now you can find communal apartments in the very center of Moscow, in houses where a square meter costs some enormous amounts of money. Residents just don't want to leave such a place, even if the floor is crashing down under their feet. Another category of people living in communalkas lives in them for the same reason, but rather involuntary. Poor and young people often have no money for a separate flat, so they live together. It is great if they live together with friends, but this is not always the case. Rooms in communalkas are very popular on the market in Moscow and especially in St. Petersburg, and their popularity doesn't decrease. You can call it co-living, but the truth stays the same. They are just good old communalkas. And some people like it. Some people like the feeling of a big family living in one big bubbling organism. I've met young guys who literally say I wouldn't change this feeling for anything else. Of course, they are mostly very young and have no family with them. I guess when they start their own family, their perception will quickly change. But communalkas, they're like Grandpa Lenin. They lived, they live, and they will continue to live.